In last week's video, we started this apple painting, so in this one, part 2, we're just going to continue along and finish it up. Now, the first thing that I want to do here is continue painting in this dark cast shadow right underneath the apple that extends to the left. Because of the lighting, it has a pretty sharp edge, so I'm using a part of my stencil here to line it up with my drawing that I have right underneath the apple, and I'm spraying in some of this black paint. And you can see in real time how slowly I'm doing this. I'm just lining up the shield where I want some of that paint and then spraying a little bit in at a time. And like I said in last week's video, this study is actually pretty simple to paint. Just remember not to rush and don't panic if you make a mistake or things don't go the way that you hoped. When you're drawing or painting, mistakes are going to happen. It's just part of the game. Use them to learn from. The most important thing is just not to give up. Keep drawing, keep painting, stick with it, keep your head up. You're going to be just fine. I'm lining up another part of my stencil here along the lower part of this apple, and I'm just spraying some of this black paint in below it just to get that transition between the apple and the cast shadow added in. And then when I remove this part of the shield, you're going to see that we get a very sharp line here along that transition point between the apple and the cast shadow underneath. So what I'm going to do here is just soften it up a little bit by using my airbrush freehand and spraying along that transition point. I'll add a crop section of my completed painting over on the left side of the screen so you can see what we're working towards, and I'm going to continue here working on this cast shadow. I'm just using a random part of this shield along that edge on the left side here and then spraying some paint over to the left. Like I talked about last week, this painting is going to have some exaggerated contrast in it, meaning really dark darks and very bright brights. And in order for me to get this cast shadow really dark, essentially pure black in some parts, I need to add multiple layers of this black paint to build up to that final dark value. So like always, I'm just taking my time with this. I'm just spraying a little bit of black paint at a time and then just backing away from the canvas to see what it looks like. Sometimes when you back up from your painting and see it from a distance, you'll spot some things that you didn't notice before. It just helps you see it in a different light. And at this point, the shadow and the cast shadow are in place. So what I'm going to do is go back to the apple and we're going to start adding some texture in here. The right side of this apple is still a bit too light, so what I'm going to do here is darken it up with that opaque red mixture that we mixed in last week's video. I don't want any of this red paint getting onto the blank part of the panel to the right where the wood texture is going to be, so I'm going back to my stencil and just lining it up with the right side of this apple. As I'm spraying in this paint right now along that edge, you notice that you can't even see my airbrush. That's because I'm holding it about 6-7 inches away from the panel. I try to move my airbrush as I'm doing this in small circular motions. I'm not trying to stop in one area so I get an even value of this red down. And as I start moving along to the left side of the apple, I will use that shield again just to mask off the left side so that I don't get any of this red paint into that black background. And because the background along the top left is pure black, it's not really a big deal if I get some red paint back there because I could always switch over to the color black later on and spray it back over to darken it up. And from here, I'm going to switch over to that second opaque red mixture, the one that had a little bit more green in it to desaturate the red and darken it up. And I'm spraying that along the lower right-hand side of the apple. And you can see that starts to kind of round it away. It starts to make it look a little bit more three-dimensional. And then finally, I'm switching over to the color sepia, which is a transparent color, and just adding it along a few of those transition points between the red and the black of that very dark shadow. So you can start to see at this point how very important those dark values are to create the illusion of this apple. Now, I exaggerated some of the contrast in this one by making my darks darker than the photo reference, but you can clearly see here how these darker values along the lower left and the right side of the apple look like they're just kind of rounding away from the light source. And then the midtones here, and finally the specular highlight on the upper right hand side of the apple just looks like it's closer to the light source, which of course is above and to the right of the apple. Now across this whole apple, there's a fair amount of texture. There's these little dots, the lenticels, all across this apple, and they're a bit lighter than the value of the red paint down now. And in order to add these in, it's very simple. I'm just using an aggressive eraser and drawing them in, just removing a small amount of paint to lighten up a few dots. Now there's a fair amount of opaque paint added onto this panel, so this paint is going to be a lot more resilient than a very thin layer of transparent paint. So what I'm doing here is just working my way around this surface with a bunch of different erasers and just kind of scuffing up some areas of the paint. This way I could just add some very subtle texture into this paint without actually removing it from the surface. I'm just removing a very thin layer off the top. For all of the subtle textures on the skin of the apple, I'm mainly using soft erasers with a very light amount of pressure. And then for those dots, I need to remove some more paint, so that's where I switch over to the more aggressive eraser, an ink eraser, just so I could remove more paint. And with this ink eraser, I'm just using some more pressure on it than the softer erasers, just pushing a little bit more into that paint so I can remove more from the surface. And I do still get a fair amount of control here, just playing around with the pressure. If I want a brighter dot, I use more pressure on that eraser. If I want a lighter, softer one, I use less pressure. I also want to make sure to add some variety to the edges of these dots. Some of them are going to be very sharp and some are going to be a bit softer and diffused. So for one that's going to be a bit softer, like this one right here, I'm switching over to a soft eraser and just making a few passes, kind of like a circular or an oval motion. This removes a smaller amount of paint and gives a nice soft diffused edge. And it's a bit subtle, but you could definitely see the differences. Soft edges here done with a soft eraser with a light amount of pressure, and then sharper edges for the ones like these where I'm using a more aggressive eraser and using a bit more pressure on it. I just mix those up across the apple's skin texture just to add some variety into it. And then I'll just continue using that exact same technique, always looking at my reference. That's going to guide me. And I would say at this point, the skin texture is pretty much complete. It's like 95% of the way there. When I finish the painting, I will come back to this later on and just kind of rework a few things, but it's essentially going to look like this in the final painting. So here's a before and after shot of the skin texture. All of that texture was rendered with the eraser, and it's a pretty forgiving technique because if any of these textures got a little bit too bright, I could always go back to that opaque red mixture and just spray a bit over the top. Now from here, what we're going to do is paint in some of this wood texture along the right side of the painting. The first thing that I'm using here is a texture stencil that I made myself in Photoshop. This was actually very easy to do as well. I took a brush with a jagged random edge on it and then just painted in a bunch of thin horizontal lines that are parallel to one another. The color that I'm using for this is a transparent color. It's a mixture of 50% burnt umber and 50% sepia. So I lined up this stencil so that it's parallel to the bottom of the panel and then just sprayed on some of this paint. And you can see when I lift it up what type of texture I get. It's just a bunch of horizontal lines with some randomness in it and some texture. And so this is obviously going to be the darker part of this wood texture, and I'm coming in with an eraser now and just lightening up some of the highlights and cleaning up some of the edges. I can also erase out some of the areas that may have gotten a bit too dark. And then I'm just going to dust on a very thin layer of this transparent paint over the top using a shield to mask off the apple. This is that same transparent color, the mixture of sepia and burnt umber, and I'll just continue working my way up. I'll spray a little bit more on that transition point where the wood table just kind of fades into that black background. And that transition point looks a little bit blotchy now, but we'll clean it up later with some more layers of paint. And now this next part is nice and simple. I'm going to come in with my eraser with a moderate amount of pressure and just pull out the highlights in between these shadows of the wood texture. And like I talked about on the skin texture of the apple, I'm trying to add some variety into these highlights. I'm not pulling them all out the exact same tone. Some parts I'm applying more pressure, some parts less. That way I just get some variety in there. Some of the highlights are a bit brighter and some are a bit darker. I'll take a straight edge with the same color of transparent paint and just spray in some of that background just to kind of sharpen it up. And then I'll apply a thin glaze of this transparent paint over those highlights that I just pulled out. The wood texture in the back is a little bit softer. It's kind of out of focus, so I'm just going to draw this in with the airbrush. The airbrush is naturally going to spray in some very soft lines, kind of give you a blurred effect. So I'm using a shield to mask off the left side of the apple so none of this paint gets onto the red. And then I'm just drawing in a few lines, some different shapes and variety in these for that wood texture itself. And I'm looking at my reference as I'm doing this. Now this wood texture in the background has the shadows and the midtones, but it's also going to need some highlights here within this texture. Now you could paint those in with an airbrush, that'll work great, but I decided here to use a soft eraser and just lightly go over some parts of the midtone just to remove some very soft, light amount of paint. A soft eraser like this does a pretty decent job at giving you a relatively soft edge. It's not as sharp as a more aggressive eraser. And it's very, very important that I don't apply too much pressure because I'm not trying to remove that much paint, just a small amount off the top. And that's pretty much it for this one. All I'm doing now is coming around with my airbrush with that transparent paint, that wood color, and just cleaning up a few mistakes. Like there's an area right here where I accidentally erased too much paint. It looked a bit blotchy, so I'm just coming in with my detail airbrush and just spraying in some of the lighter areas to darken them up, just blend it with the rest of the wood texture. I want to thank all of you so much for being here. I hope that you picked up something to use in your own paintings. And before I go, of course, I want to say thank you so much to the very generous support of the current channel members. I'd like to welcome the newest members this week. That's Funky Monkey. It's a great name, a tier 3. Thank you so much. Christopher R., Taper Game, and Carl, both rejoining. Thank you guys all so very much. And I do hope that all of you guys have a great week. Wish you all the best in your paintings or drawings, and I'll see you back here next week.